Aurora Sullivan sat in the vinyl chair by the window of room 247, her fingers trembling against the pearl necklace she'd worn every day for 6 months, watching the parking lot like a woman waiting for a miracle that would never arrive. Day 183. She'd counted every single one. The afternoon light slanted through the blinds of Meadowbrook Nursing Home in golden stripes that made the institutional beige walls look almost warm, almost forgiving, almost like someone gave a damn whether she lived or died in this place. She didn't move when the dinner cart rattled past her door, didn't flinch when Mrs. Chen across the hall started screaming for her daughter again, didn't bother checking the visitor log anymore because she already knew what it would say. Nothing. No one. Not today. Not ever. The Hermes bag sat beside her bed, like a relic from another life. The Louis Vuitton luggage tucked in her closet behind the donated cardigans. The diamond tennis bracelet hidden under the loose floorboard beneath her nightstand, where $40 million worth of secrets lived and breathed and waited. Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome back to another story that's going to absolutely wreck you today. I need you to tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, because this one hits different depending on whether you're someone's child or someone's parent. And before we go any further, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, I'm begging you to hit that button, because these stories about family, betrayal, and the brutal truth about who really loves us when we have nothing left to give. These are the stories nobody else is telling. Are you subscribed? Good. You're going to need that community for what's coming. Now let me tell you about Aurora Sullivan, 81 years old, widow, mother of 2, grandmother of 5, self-made multi-millionaire, and the loneliest woman in a building full of forgotten people. She checked herself into this place 6 months ago, after making the kind of decision that would either prove her wrong or destroy what was left of her faith in the family she'd built from her own flesh and sacrifice and blood. The money was gone, she told them on the phone, her voice carefully constructed to sound frail and defeated and broken. Medical bills, bad investments, the market crash, all of it, the mansion in Pacific Heights, the vacation home in Napa, the investment portfolio, the trust funds she'd promised, vanished. I'm so sorry, she'd whispered to her son Thomas, hearing the silence stretch like a chasm between them. I have nothing left to give you. The pause that followed told her everything she'd feared, and nothing she'd wanted to hear. That was March. This was September, and in 6 months, 183 days, for 392 hours of sitting in this chair by this window, watching other people's children arrive with flowers and apologies and love. Her own children had visited exactly 0 times. Her son Thomas Costigan, 47, venture capitalist, father of 3, owner of the tech company she'd personally funded with $2.3 million when the banks laughed him out of their offices, had called once in July to tell her he couldn't make it for her birthday because of a conference in Singapore. Her daughter, Emma Costello, 43 divorce attorney, mother of 2, living in the house Aurora had bought her after that ugly separation, had sent flowers on Mother's Day, wilted carnations clearly ordered by an assistant who typed the wrong delivery date. The grandchildren? Radio silence. Complete erasure. Like she'd never raised 2 of them for 26 months, while Emma rebuilt her career and her life. Like she'd never paid for private schools and college tuitions and weddings with 6-tier cakes and destination rehearsal dinners. Like the sacrifices she'd made, the 20-hour days building her consulting empire from nothing, the meals eaten cold and alone at her desk, the school plays missed, the recitals skipped, the moments lost forever in service of building them a future. Like none of it had ever mattered at all. Aurora's fingers moved to the visitor chair beside her bed, touching the armrest that had never held the weight of her children's love. Mrs. Patterson, 3 doors down, had her daughter visit every Tuesday and Friday like clockwork. Mr. Yamamoto had his whole family come on Sundays, with homemade food and grandchildren who crawled into his lap. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, whose mind was mostly gone, had a son who sat beside her bed reading poetry in Spanish. She couldn't understand anymore, but somehow still made her smile. Aurora had a dust-covered chair and a phone that never rang, and a test she'd designed in desperation that was killing her slowly with its answer. The $40 million sat in an irrevocable trust her lawyer had constructed with surgical precision, hidden behind shell companies and offshore accounts, and legal structures her children would never find. She'd stripped away everything visible: the cars, the clothes, the zip code, the country club membership, the Black American Express card, and checked herself into this place wearing Target jeans and carrying 2 suitcases like a woman who'd lost everything. Then she'd waited to see who would come when she had nothing left to offer but herself. The answer was destroying her. At 4:47 p.m., like every day before, Aurora heard the sound of an engine in the parking lot and felt her heart betray her with hope. Felt herself lean forward in the chair. Felt the familiar crushing disappointment when the car belonged to someone else's salvation. How much longer could she endure this? How much longer before the test became the punishment? And what would she do when she finally accepted the truth her children had already shown her? That without her money, she'd never been a mother at all. Just a bank account with a heartbeat. And now that the account was empty, even the heartbeat didn't matter anymore. Aurora hadn't always been a woman who measured love in visitor logs and empty chairs. There was a time when she believed family was something you built with your hands and your heart, and your willingness to bleed for people who would never understand the price you paid. She'd been 19 when she married James Braddock, a mechanic with gentle hands and big dreams who died of a heart attack at 53, before he ever got to see the empire she built from the ruins of their early poverty, before he ever knew that the girl he married in a courthouse wearing a borrowed dress would become the woman who turned a failing consulting business into a $40 million fortune through sheer will and sleepless nights, and a refusal to let her children grow up the way she did: hungry, invisible, afraid. Thomas had been 3, and Emma was 6 months old when James died, leaving Aurora with $8,000 in debt, a rusted Chevy Nova, and 2 babies who needed everything she didn't have. And that's when something fundamental shifted inside her. When she stopped being a woman who asked for help and became a woman who made things happen regardless of the cost. She worked 3 jobs that first year: bookkeeping during the day, waitressing at night, weekend freelance consulting for small businesses who couldn't afford the big firms, sleeping 4 hours if she was lucky, feeding her children before she fed herself, wearing the same 2 outfits for 18 months, because every spare dollar went into their mouths and their future. By the time Thomas was 10, she'd built Sullivan Consulting into a mid-tier firm. By the time he was 15, she was hiring employees. By the time he graduated high school, she was handling Fortune 500 clients and living in a house with more bedrooms than they could fill. She'd done it, climbed out of poverty, gave them private schools and college funds, and a life where money was never the monster under the bed. But somewhere in those years of building and grinding and sacrificing, she'd missed the part where they were supposed to become people who loved her, for reasons that had nothing to do with what she could provide. Thomas Costigan was a man who looked exactly like his father, but had none of James's softness. All sharp angles and sharper ambition, the kind of son who called her Mom, but treated her like a business partner. And Aurora knew it was partly her fault, because she'd raised him to be hungry, to be strategic, to see opportunities and seize them. And apparently she'd been the biggest opportunity of all. He'd married a woman named Vanessa, who smiled with her mouth, but never her eyes. Produced 3 children Aurora barely knew, because they were always at camps or academies or enrichment programs, and built a tech company on Aurora's money that he somehow convinced himself he'd earned alone. Emma Costello was different, but the same. Softer in presentation, but equally transactional in practice. A divorce attorney who'd learned from watching her mother that independence meant never needing anyone, and somehow translated that into never being available when Aurora needed her. She'd married badly, a man who cheated and lied and drained their accounts, and Aurora had taken in her grandchildren Dylan and Sophie for 26 months, while Emma rebuilt, had fed them and raised them and loved them like her own. And the second Emma was stable again, she'd scooped them up and moved 3 hours away to Sacramento for a fresh start that conveniently made spontaneous visits impossible. If you've ever given everything to your kids and wondered if they actually see you or just see what you can do for them. Drop a comment right now, because I know Aurora's story is hitting some of you in places you don't talk about at family dinners. The only person who seemed to see Aurora as a human being at Meadowbrook was Nurse Clarice Baxter, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a Caribbean accent, who'd emigrated from Trinidad 20 years ago and understood what it meant to sacrifice everything for family who forgot to say thank you. Clarice was the one who found Aurora crying that Tuesday in October, who held her hand without judgment, who started sitting with her during the 4:47 p.m. window, watching when Aurora's hope was most dangerous, who brought her real coffee instead of the institutional sludge they served in the dining hall, who never once asked why a woman with a Hermes bag and a Harry Winston watch was living in a nursing home that accepted Medicaid patients. "Your children don't visit," Clarice said one evening. Not a question, but an observation delivered with the gentleness of someone who'd seen this story play out 100 times in 100 rooms with 100 forgotten parents. And Aurora had looked at her with eyes that held decades of suppressed rage and grief and said the things she'd never admitted out loud. "I think I raised them to need me, but not to love me. And now that they don't need me anymore, I'm finding out there was never any love underneath." That was Aurora's deepest fear, the thing that woke her at 3 a.m. in cold sweats. The terror that every sacrifice had been a transaction she'd fooled herself into calling devotion, that she'd built a fortune but failed to build a family, that the test she designed wasn't revealing who her children truly were, but confirming what she'd always suspected and desperately hoped was wrong. That without her money she was nothing to them, that the woman who gave them life was only valuable as long as she could fund their lives. That love had always been conditional, and she'd been too busy building their future to notice they'd never loved her past. But there was something else too, something Clarice couldn't see, something nobody at Meadowbrook knew. Aurora wasn't just a forgotten mother waiting to die in room 247. She was a woman with $40 million and a plan and a decision coming that would either redeem this nightmare or make it permanent. And the clock was ticking on how much longer her heart could endure the answer her children kept giving her every single day they chose not to come. Aurora collapsed in the dining hall on a Thursday morning in late September, her body crumpling between the cafeteria table and the industrial linoleum floor, while her oatmeal spilled across the table in a spreading gray puddle that nobody noticed for 7 seconds. Because when you're elderly and invisible, even your emergencies have to wait their turn. Clarice reached her first, calling for the crash cart, while Aurora's vision tunneled and her chest squeezed like someone had wrapped her ribs in barbed wire and was pulling tight. And the only thought in her oxygen-starved brain was a bitter, laughing realization that she might die here on this floor, surrounded by strangers while her children were probably in meetings, checking their stock portfolios built on her money. The ambulance took 14 minutes to arrive, and Aurora spent every one of them conscious enough to hear Mrs. Patterson crying, to feel Clarice's hand gripping hers, to understand that this was it, the universe forcing a decision she'd been avoiding for 183 days. The hospital smelled like bleached fear and broken promises, and Aurora woke up in the ICU with monitors beeping her mortality in steady rhythms, and a cardiologist named Dr. Raymond Chen telling her in a voice that had delivered this speech too many times that she'd had a severe angina episode, that her heart was weaker than it should be, that stress and loneliness were clinical killers as deadly as any disease. We need to contact your family, the nurse said, reaching for the emergency contact form, and Aurora heard herself say no with such force that the woman actually stepped back. No family? The nurse asked, confused, and Aurora clarified with a voice made of razor blades. I have family. I just don't have family who comes. But Clarice had already called them. She admitted it later with apologetic eyes, had reached Thomas's office and Emma's assistant, and told them both that their mother had collapsed, that she was in St. Mary's Hospital, that she might have died. Thomas texted back 3 hours later, Is she stable? I'm in the middle of a product launch. Emma's assistant sent flowers with a card that said, Thinking of you, in generic printed script that could have been for a coworker or a client, or anyone who mattered just enough to warrant $15 and 30 seconds of effort. Aurora lay in that hospital bed staring at those flowers and felt something inside her calcify into a decision that would change everything. She was done waiting, done testing, done hoping the next day would be different. Her children had just failed the only exam that actually mattered, and now she needed to decide what to do with that answer. The plot twist came 3 days later, when Aurora was transferred back to Meadowbrook, still weak but stable, and found that the room next to hers, 247B, previously empty, had a new occupant, and that occupant was a man named Harrison Lockwood, who was 79 years old, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and according to the nurse's whispered gossip, a retired federal judge who checked himself into Meadowbrook, despite having 3 devoted children because he wanted peace and quiet to read without family hovering. Aurora met him properly on her second day, back when he knocked on her doorframe and asked in a voice textured with education and old money if she played chess. And she said yes, even though she hadn't touched a chess piece in 15 years, because there was something in his eyes that suggested he saw through the performance everyone else was watching. They played in the common room that afternoon, and Harrison beat her in 17 moves, then looked at her across the board and said something that made her hands freeze on the captured pieces. You don't belong here, do you? I mean, you belong in a nursing home as much as I do, which is to say not at all, which makes me wonder what we're both really doing in a place like this. Aurora's heart did something complicated and dangerous, and she heard herself ask, What are you doing here? And Harrison smiled with the kind of sadness that comes from understanding human nature too well, and said, Testing my children to see if they love me enough to respect my choices even when they disagree. And you. She could have lied, could have maintained the fiction. But something about Harrison's directness and the way he'd phrased his own truth made her answer honestly for the first time in 6 months. Testing mine to see if they love me at all when I have nothing left to give them. Harrison nodded, like she'd confirmed something he already suspected, and then he said the thing that would become the inciting incident for everything that followed. How's that working out for you? And Aurora felt tears she'd been suppressing for 189 days. Suddenly threatened to break through, because the answer was, It's destroying me, it's killing me. I can't do this anymore, but I can't stop because stopping means accepting the truth. And I'm not ready to bury my children while I'm still alive. I had a heart episode because of this test, Aurora whispered. And Harrison reached across the chessboard and took her hand, the first man to touch her with tenderness since James died 28 years ago, and said, Then maybe it's time to stop testing and start deciding what you're going to do with the answer they've already given you. That night, Aurora called her lawyer Mitchell Green and said 5 words that set everything in motion. I want to change everything. Mitchell arrived the next morning with documents and questions, and Aurora told him the new plan. She was giving herself 30 more days, 1 final month, to see if her near-death experience would prompt her children to visit. And if they didn't come, if they maintained their silence even when they knew she'd collapsed and might die, then she wanted the will changed, the trust redirected. Everything she'd built given to anyone but the people who'd shown her that blood meant nothing when the bank account ran dry. Are you sure? Mitchell asked, and Aurora looked at him with eyes that had finally run out of hope and said, I'm sure that I need to know if I'm making this decision out of grief or if I'm making it out of clarity, and 30 days will tell me which one it is. If you've ever had to decide whether to keep hoping or start grieving while the people you love are still alive, leave a comment because this is the moment Aurora stops being a victim and starts being something much more dangerous. A mother with nothing left to lose, and 40 million reasons to make sure the truth costs exactly what it should. The 30-day countdown began on October 1st, and Aurora marked each day on a small calendar she kept hidden in her nightstand drawer next to the diamond tennis bracelet and the bank statements that proved she was the richest woman in a building full of people who'd been abandoned by prosperity. Day 1. No calls, no visits, no acknowledgement that she'd nearly died, except a forwarded email from Thomas's assistant about updating her emergency contacts for efficiency purposes. Day 2. Harrison brought her coffee in a real mug he'd somehow smuggled past the nurses, and they played chess in her room because she was still too weak for the common area. And he told her about his daughter Margaret, who called him every morning at 8, despite his insistence that he was fine, who respected his choice to be here, even though it broke her heart. And Aurora felt something dark and acidic rise in her throat that might have been envy or might have been rage. Day 3. Emma finally called. 23 minutes of conversation that felt like a deposition, asking questions about Aurora's medical directives and whether there was life insurance, and had she considered simplifying her affairs, given her declining health. And not once, not a single time did she ask how Aurora was feeling, or if she was scared, or if she needed her daughter to just sit with her while the fear of dying alone became something less suffocating. Aurora hung up and threw her phone across the room hard enough to crack the screen, and Harrison heard the impact from next door and appeared in her doorway with concern etched in the lines around his eyes. And she found herself crying in front of him for the second time, found herself being held by a man who was practically a stranger, except he felt more like family than the people who shared her DNA. They only care about the money, Aurora said into Harrison's shoulder, breathing in his scent of old books and expensive cologne that he absolutely shouldn't have been able to afford on a judge's pension, and he stroked her hair and said, Then stop giving them reasons to pretend it's anything else. Day 7. Thomas sent an email, not a call, an email, asking if she'd made any estate planning changes recently, because his financial advisor suggested he should have clarity on future inheritances for tax purposes. And the sheer audacity of it. The brazen, transparent greed made Aurora laugh until she couldn't breathe. Made her laugh so hard that Clarice came running thinking she was having another cardiac episode. Day 9. Harrison kissed her for the first time. Just a soft press of lips in the garden behind Meadowbrook, where the autumn roses were dying in beautiful slow motion. And Aurora felt something she thought had died with James. Desire, want, the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone see you, not as a mother or a millionaire, but just as a woman who was tired and lonely and desperate for proof that she was worth loving without conditions. Day 12. Margaret Lockwood visited her father, and Aurora watched through the window as this elegant woman in her 50s held Harrison's hand and laughed at his stories, and brought him homemade soup in a thermos. Watched the kind of love she'd spent 6 months praying to see in her own children. And later that night, she asked Harrison how he'd raised children who actually gave a damn, and he said something that cracked her open. I loved them more than I needed them to validate me, and I never let money become the language we spoke instead of affection. Day 15. Mitchell the lawyer called with news. He'd been doing research on Thomas's company and found irregularities. Discovered that Thomas had been telling investors that Aurora was a silent partner with ongoing financial involvement. Had been using her name and reputation to secure funding, while simultaneously treating her like she was already dead. and Mitchell asked if she wanted him to investigate further, because this might constitute fraud. Aurora said yes, said she wanted to know everything, said that the truth might be ugly, but it couldn't be uglier than the fantasy she'd been clinging to. Day 18. Emma's assistant called to reschedule a lunch meeting that had never been scheduled in the first place. And when Aurora said, "Is Emma planning to visit me?" the assistant went silent for so long that Aurora could hear keyboard clicking in the background before she said, "Ms. Costello is extremely busy with client depositions, but she thinks about you often." And Aurora wondered what kind of person outsources thinking about their dying mother. Day 21. Harrison introduced Aurora to his son Charles, who visited every Wednesday. And Charles was kind and funny, and asked Aurora questions about her life. Like her answers actually mattered. And after he left, she turned to Harrison with accusation in her eyes and said, "Your children aren't like mine, so how can you possibly understand what I'm going through?" And Harrison looked at her with something between pity and frustration and said, "My children are like this because I taught them how to be, Aurora. And maybe the question isn't why yours are different, but what you taught them instead." It was the first fight they'd had, and it felt like being flayed open. Felt like Harrison was suggesting this was her fault, and she didn't speak to him for 2 days. Day 23. Clarice sat with Aurora during the 4:47 p.m. window watching, and said something that made Aurora's chest tight. "You know what I see? I see a woman punishing herself for her children's failures. Like their inability to love you properly is somehow proof that you're not worth loving at all. And Miss Aurora, that's the biggest lie you've ever told yourself." Day 26. Aurora and Harrison reconciled in the common room over chess, and he apologized for being harsh, but not for being honest. And he said, "You taught them that your value was in your wallet, and now you're angry that they believed you." And Aurora hated that he was right. Hated that maybe this test wasn't revealing who her children were, but who she trained them to be. Day 28. Thomas left a voicemail asking if Aurora had recovered from that health scare, and mentioning that he needed a reference letter for a new investor, and could she write something brief about his business acumen. And he signed off with, "Love you, Mom," in a tone that made the words mean absolutely nothing. Day 29. Mitchell called with the full investigation results, and what he'd found was devastating. Thomas had forged her signature on 3 documents. Emma had been telling her social circle that Aurora was mentally declining, to explain why they never saw her, and both of them had been to an estate attorney asking about the process for declaring someone incompetent. Aurora listened to all of it with a strange calm, and thanked Mitchell, and hung up, and sat in the chair by the window, and realized that the 30 days were almost over, and her children had given her exactly the answer she'd been afraid of. Day 30. Harrison held her hand and asked what she was going to do now. And Aurora looked at him with eyes that had finally run out of tears, and said, "I'm going to make sure the truth costs them everything they thought they were entitled to. And if you've ever reached the point where love turns to something else, where you have to choose between protecting people who hurt you and protecting yourself from people who never loved you, tell me in the comments what you chose. Because Aurora's about to make a decision that can't be undone." The game changed on day 31 when Mitchell Green arrived at Meadowbrook unannounced with a manila folder thick enough to represent betrayal in physical form, his face carrying the expression lawyers get when they've discovered something so unconscionable that it temporarily overrides their professional detachment. Aurora was in the garden with Harrison, his arm around her shoulders, while they watched the October wind strip leaves from the oak tree in violent golden spirals. And when she saw Mitchell's face, she knew that whatever was in that folder would be the thing that finally killed the last stubborn seedling of hope she'd been keeping alive against all evidence and reason. "We need to talk privately," Mitchell said, glancing at Harrison with the territorial suspicion lawyers have toward anyone who might complicate their client's legal position, but Aurora gripped Harrison's hand and said, "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of him." Because after 30 days of chess and coffee and stolen kisses and brutal honesty, Harrison had earned the right to witness her destruction. Mitchell opened the folder, and Aurora's world inverted. The documents showed that Thomas and Emma had retained an elder law attorney named Philip Vance, that they'd been building a case for conservatorship for the past 7 weeks, that they'd collected evidence of Aurora's diminished capacity, including statements from Emma claiming Aurora had called her at 3 a.m. confused and disoriented, testimony from Thomas alleging she'd forgotten conversations about money management, even a letter from a psychiatrist neither Aurora nor Mitchell had ever heard of suggesting early-stage dementia based on family interviews without ever actually examining Aurora herself. "They're planning to have you declared incompetent," Mitchell said, his voice shaking with rage that mirrored the ice spreading through Aurora's veins. "And once they do, they'll control your assets, your medical decisions, everything. They've already drafted the paperwork to transfer guardianship, and they're planning to file within 2 weeks." Aurora stared at the documents, at her children's signatures on page after page of legal fiction designed to erase her autonomy, at the calculated, systematic destruction of her personhood by the 2 people she'd grown inside her own body. And she felt something fundamental break and reform into something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "They think I'm already incompetent," Aurora said slowly. "They think because I'm in a nursing home, I must be incapable of managing my own life, which means they don't know about the 40 million. Which means they're doing this for whatever scraps they think are left." Harrison's hand tightened on hers, and Mitchell nodded grimly and said, "It gets worse. I found emails between Thomas and Emma discussing how once they have conservatorship, they'll move you to a state facility to preserve assets, which is legal language for warehousing you in the cheapest possible institution while they liquidate everything they can find." The betrayal was so complete, so totalizing, that Aurora actually felt her heart rate slow, felt herself go calm the way soldiers describe combat, the strange clarity that comes when fear becomes irrelevant, because the worst thing has already happened. "Show me everything," Aurora said, and for the next hour, Mitchell walked her through the architecture of her children's greed. The forged documents, the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, the financial projections they'd made about maximizing inheritance value, the emails where Emma called her the obstacle, and Thomas referred to her as the asset, never once using the word mother, never once suggesting she was a human being who deserved dignity or agency or love. Harrison sat beside Aurora through all of it, his hand never leaving hers, and when Mitchell finally closed the folder, Harrison said something that made Aurora look at him with new eyes. "I know what you're feeling right now, because I felt it 17 years ago when my wife died and my children started circling her jewelry before we'd even planned the funeral." Aurora turned to him sharply because this was new information, a crack in Harrison's carefully maintained veneer. And he met her gaze and continued. "They weren't bad people. They were just people who'd been taught that inheritance was entitlement. And I had to make a choice about whether to give them what they expected or teach them what they needed to learn. And Aurora, I chose the lesson even though it hurt like hell." "What did you do?" Aurora whispered, and Harrison's smile was sad and knowing. "I put everything in a trust that required them to demonstrate 5 years of genuine relationship with me. Visits, calls, involvement in my life that wasn't transactional, before they could access a single dollar. And you know what happened. Margaret passed the test within 2 years because she actually loved me. Charles took 4 years, but he got there. And my youngest daughter, Catherine, failed completely, and we haven't spoken in a decade. But at least I know the truth." Aurora absorbed this revelation, this confession that Harrison understood her test from lived experience. and she felt the connection between them deepen from attraction into something that felt like recognition, like finding the only other person who spoke a language everyone else had forgotten. "They're going to file in 2 weeks," Mitchell said, pulling them back to the immediate crisis. "Which means you need to make decisions now. Do you want me to fight the conservatorship? Do you want to go public with the forgeries? Do you want to—" And that's when the second revelation hit. The twist that complicated everything. Clarissa appeared in the doorway of the garden room, her face apologetic and confused, and said, "Miss Aurora, you have a visitor. Your granddaughter Sophie is in the lobby, and she's asking to see you." The world stopped. Sophie, Emma's daughter. The little girl Aurora had raised for 26 months, who was now 17 and hadn't visited once in 6 months, and was suddenly here on the exact day Aurora had discovered her mother's legal conspiracy. Harrison felt Aurora's hand go rigid, and Mitchell immediately went into lawyer mode, saying, "Don't see her! It could be a setup. They could be gathering evidence for the competency hearing." But Aurora was already standing, already moving toward the lobby because she needed to know if this was coincidence or calculation. Needed to see Sophie's face and understand if there was a single person in her bloodline who'd come for reasons that had nothing to do with money or legal strategy. Sophie was standing by the reception desk wearing her high school volleyball jacket and crying, actual tears streaming down her face. And when she saw Aurora, she ran forward and wrapped her arms around her grandmother and said the words Aurora had been starving to hear for 196 days. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were sick. Mom never told me. I only found out yesterday when I overheard her on the phone with Uncle Thomas, and I skipped school to take the bus here because I couldn't stand the thought of you being alone." Aurora held her granddaughter and felt her carefully constructed walls crack, felt hope surge back into the space where she'd been building resolve. And she looked over Sophie's shoulder at Harrison and Mitchell and saw them both wearing identical expressions that said, "Be careful. This could still be manipulation. Trust but verify." And Aurora realized that the midpoint revelation wasn't just about what her children were planning. It was about whether she could still distinguish between genuine love and sophisticated performance. Whether Sophie's tears were real or rehearsed. Whether she was about to make the worst mistake of this entire nightmare. Or whether she was finally being given a reason to believe that something she'd built might actually have value beyond dollars and cents. And if you've ever had to decide whether to trust your heart or trust your experience when they're screaming opposite things, leave a comment because Aurora's next move will determine everything. Sophie's visit lasted 47 minutes of tearful apologies and tight embraces, and stories about school and volleyball, and how much she'd missed Aurora. And it felt so achingly real that Aurora let herself believe it completely until the moment Sophie's phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen and her face did something subtle, a micro-expression of calculation that lasted maybe half a second. But Harrison caught it from across the lobby, and later when Sophie had left, he asked Aurora the question that poisoned everything. "Did you notice she didn't ask you a single question about your health?" Aurora replayed the conversation in her mind and felt ice water replace her blood. Because Harrison was right. Sophie had apologized for not visiting, had cried about missing her, had talked extensively about her own life, but never once asked how Aurora was feeling, what the doctor said, if she was scared, if she needed anything, almost like she'd been briefed to appear concerned without gathering information that could contradict a narrative. "You're being paranoid," Aurora said, but her voice lacked conviction, and Harrison looked at her with heartbreaking gentleness and said, "Am I, or am I just seeing what you're afraid to say?" The answer came 6 hours later when Mitchell called with security footage he'd subpoenaed from Thomas's office building, footage showing Sophie entering Thomas's office 3 days before her visit, staying for 90 minutes, leaving with an envelope, and Mitchell's voice was tight with fury when he said, "They sent her Aurora. They coached her. This was reconnaissance. Aurora hung up and vomited into the small trash can beside her bed, retching up not just her dinner, but the last fragile piece of hope she'd been clutching. The belief that maybe one person in her family loved her without agenda. And the darkness that swallowed her then was so complete that when Clarice found her 20 minutes later, she was sitting on the bathroom floor, whispering, "There's nothing left. There's nothing left," like a mantra against reality. Day 33 brought worse news. Mitchell discovered that Thomas and Emma had accelerated their timeline, were filing the conservatorship petition that Friday instead of waiting 2 weeks. And the reason was a poison pill. Someone had tipped them off that Aurora was engaging in a romantic relationship with another resident, and they were spinning it as evidence of impaired judgment and vulnerability to exploitation, which meant Harrison had transformed from Aurora's lifeline into a legal liability. "They have photographs," Mitchell said, sounding defeated for the first time since Aurora had known him. "Someone's been documenting you and Harrison in the garden, holding hands, kissing, and they're going to present it as proof that you're not competent to make decisions about your own life." Aurora felt the trap close around her with mechanical precision. If she continued seeing Harrison, she gave them ammunition. If she stopped, she lost the only person who made her feel human. Either way, her children won, and she lost. And the injustice of it made her want to burn the whole world down, except she was 81 and tired, and her heart was literally failing. And what could she really do against children who'd weaponized the legal system and her own granddaughter against her? Harrison found her in her room that evening, and before he could speak, Aurora said the words that felt like self-amputation. "We need to stop seeing each other. You're being used against me. They're going to take everything because of us." Harrison's face did something terrible, something that aged him a decade in seconds. And he said, "So you're choosing to let them win. You're letting them take away the one good thing that's happened to you in this nightmare because you're afraid." And Aurora screamed back, "I'm not afraid, I'm being realistic. They have lawyers and money and a system that assumes elderly people are incompetent. And what do I have? A secret fortune I can't reveal without proving I've been lying for 6 months, and a boyfriend who makes me look mentally unstable." The word boyfriend sounded ridiculous coming from an 81-year-old woman, and Harrison flinched like she'd slapped him and said quietly, "Is that what I am to you? A liability?" And Aurora wanted to say no, wanted to say you're everything, wanted to say you're the only person who's made me feel like I'm more than a bank account with a heartbeat. But instead she said, "I need you to leave," because if she was going to lose everything she needed, to lose it on her own terms. Harrison left, and Aurora didn't see him for 3 days. 3 days where his absence felt like a physical wound. And Clarice told her that Harrison had asked to be transferred to a different facility, and the transfer was being processed, and he'd be gone by the end of the week. And Aurora realized she'd done to Harrison exactly what her children had done to her. Treated him like a problem to be managed, instead of a person to be cherished. Day 36. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for Monday, 4 days away, and Mitchell sat with Aurora in her room, surrounded by documents and legal briefs, and said with devastating honesty, "I don't think we can win. They've built a compelling case. And you being in a nursing home by choice doesn't look like eccentric independence. It looks like incapacity. And if we reveal the 40 million now, it looks like you've been hiding assets and lying to family, which actually supports their incompetency argument." Aurora stared at the calendar, where she'd marked 30 days of hope, and realized she'd designed a test that had destroyed her. She'd proven her children didn't love her, but in the process she'd given them the ammunition to take everything. She'd lost Harrison by trying to protect him. She'd been betrayed by her own granddaughter. And in 4 days, she'd stand in front of a judge who would decide if she was competent enough to control her own life. And the answer would probably be no. because the system was designed to protect people like her from themselves, except she didn't need protection. She needed someone to see that her children were the threat. Day 37. Aurora sat in the chair by the window during the 4:47 p.m. watch, and Harrison's room was dark, and he didn't come. And she understood finally completely what true loneliness felt like. It wasn't being abandoned by people who never loved you. It was pushing away the person who did because you were too broken to believe you deserved to be saved. And if you've ever lost the battle before the war even started, if you've ever been so tired that giving up felt like mercy, tell me in the comments how you found the strength to take one more step, because Aurora can't see the path forward, and the darkness is winning. The turning point came at 3 a.m. on day 38, when Aurora couldn't sleep, because regret is louder than any alarm clock. When she finally admitted to herself that she'd spent 6 months testing her children's love, while simultaneously proving she didn't know how to accept love when it was actually offered, and the realization hit her with the force of revelation. Harrison wasn't a liability, fear was. And she'd let Thomas and Emma weaponize her fear one more time. Let them take from her one more thing. Let them win one more battle without even fighting back. She got out of bed, put on the cashmere robe she'd hidden in the back of her closet, walked down the darkened hallway to Harrison's room, and found it empty. Furniture covered in sheets, the chess set they'd played with packed away in a box by the door. And she felt panic rise until Clarice appeared behind her and said softly, "He didn't leave yet. His transfer got delayed by paperwork. He's in the garden." Aurora found Harrison sitting on the bench where he'd first kissed her, staring at the skeletal rose bushes in the moonlight. And when he heard her footsteps, he didn't turn around, just said, "You shouldn't be out here. It's cold, and you're recovering, and if they're watching, they'll use this against you too." Aurora sat beside him and took his hand and said the thing she should have said 3 days ago. Let them watch. Let them document it. Let them use it however they want, because I'm done letting my children's cruelty determine who I'm allowed to love. Harrison finally looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and she continued, "You were right. I chose fear over you. I let them make me believe that wanting connection at 81 was somehow proof of incompetence, instead of proof of being alive. And Harrison, I don't know if we can win on Monday, but I know I don't want to fight without you." He kissed her then, deep and urgent, and tasting like tears and second chances. And when they broke apart, he said, "I have an idea. Something Margaret suggested when I told her what was happening. But it's risky, and it requires you to trust me completely." Aurora squeezed his hand and said, "Tell me everything." Harrison's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of hiding the 40 million, reveal it strategically in court, but not as evidence of Aurora's capacity, as evidence of Thomas and Emma's motive to lie. Proof that the conservatorship wasn't about protecting Aurora, but about accessing assets they didn't know existed. And combine that with the evidence Mitchell had gathered about the forged documents and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to flip the narrative entirely. "But there's more," Harrison said, his judge's mind working through the legal chess moves. "We need Margaret to testify as a character witness. We need Clarice to provide medical testimony that you're completely competent. And we need Sophie." Aurora recoiled at the name, but Harrison gripped both her hands and said, "Sophie is 17, almost an adult. And if she was coached, then she's also a victim of Thomas and Emma's manipulation. And if we can get her alone, away from their influence, there's a chance she'll tell the truth." Day 39. Aurora, Harrison, Mitchell, and Margaret Lockwood, who turned out to be a clinical psychologist with credentials that could counter the fraudulent psychiatric report, met in the Meadowbrook conference room and built their counteroffensive. Margaret agreed to evaluate Aurora formally and provide expert testimony. Clarice documented 6 months of interactions, showing Aurora's clear cognition and independent decision-making. Mitchell prepared to introduce the forged documents and the emails calling Aurora the obstacle. and Harrison coached Aurora on how to present herself in court, not as a victim, but as a woman who'd made strategic choices about her own life. The key, Margaret explained in her calm, professional voice, is showing that your test wasn't evidence of paranoia or impaired judgment. It was a rational response to a legitimate concern that proved accurate. You suspected your children were motivated by money, and you designed an experiment that confirmed it. That's not incompetence. That's extraordinary emotional intelligence. Day 40. Aurora called Sophie directly, bypassing Emma, and said, "I need to see you alone. No phones, no parents, just you and me." And Sophie's voice cracked when she said, "Grandma, I'm so sorry. They told me you were confused and needed help, and I didn't know about the legal stuff. I swear I didn't know." They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Meadowbrook, and Aurora watched her granddaughter cry real tears this time. Watched her explain how Thomas and Emma had told her Aurora was declining mentally. How they'd said the visit was to assess her condition. How Sophie had believed she was helping until she'd overheard Emma on the phone laughing about the old woman's gullibility. And Sophie had finally understood she'd been used. "Will you tell the truth in court?" Aurora asked, and Sophie nodded and said, "I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them Mom and Uncle Thomas are liars. I'll tell them you're the sanest person I know." And Aurora felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope that maybe she'd failed the first generation, but there was still something worth saving in the second. Day 41, the day before the hearing. Harrison sat with Aurora in her room and said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that these past weeks with you have been the best part of my last decade. You made me remember what it feels like to be seen as a man instead of just a father or a judge or a tax return." And Aurora kissed him and said, "If we win tomorrow, I want to leave this place with you. I want to get an apartment downtown with you. I want to spend whatever time we have left actually living instead of testing or hiding or pretending to be less than we are." That night, Aurora laid out the outfit she'd wear to court. Not the Target jeans she'd been performing in, but the Chanel suit she'd kept hidden, the Hermes scarf, the pearl earrings, the version of herself that was both wealthy and competent, and done apologizing for either. And when Clarice saw her the next morning, she smiled and said, "There she is. There's the woman who built an empire. Go show them who they've been underestimating." Mitchell picked up Aurora and Harrison at 8 a.m. And in the car, he said, "They don't know we have Sophie. They don't know about Margaret's evaluation. They think this is going to be a formality. So when we bring the evidence, they're going to scramble. And Aurora, that's when you need to be absolutely composed, absolutely clear. Show the judge exactly how competent you are." And Aurora looked at him and said with steel in her voice, "I've been underestimated my entire life. I built a fortune from nothing while raising 2 children alone. I survived poverty and widowhood, and 6 months of intentional loneliness to prove a point. Trust me, Mitchell. I know how to show up when it matters. And if you've ever had to walk into a room and prove your worth to people who've already decided you're worthless, drop a comment with the word strength, because Aurora's about to fight the battle of her life." The courtroom in downtown Sacramento was smaller than Aurora expected, wood-paneled and fluorescent lit, and smelling like old law books and broken families. And when she walked in, wearing her Chanel suit, with Harrison beside her, and Mitchell carrying 2 briefcases full of evidence, she watched Thomas and Emma's faces cycle through confusion, alarm, and barely concealed rage at seeing their mother looking not like a confused elderly woman, but like the CEO she'd been for 30 years. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen every manipulation family law had to offer. And when Thomas's attorney, Gerald Winters, stood to present the conservatorship petition, Aurora felt Harrison squeeze her hand once for courage. And then she let go because she needed to face this with her own strength. Winters painted a picture of a tragic decline. Aurora Sullivan, once a vibrant businesswoman, now living in a nursing home after losing her fortune to confused financial decisions, exhibiting erratic behavior, including a romantic relationship with another resident, that showed impaired judgment and vulnerability to exploitation, unable to care for herself, in desperate need of her children's protective oversight. Your Honor, Winters said with performative sadness, this is a woman who raised two successful children and gave them everything. And now those children simply want to ensure she's safe and cared for in her declining years. Thomas took the stand first, wearing his most expensive suit and his most sincere expression, testifying about Aurora's confused phone calls and memory lapses, and how it broke his heart to see her deteriorate. And Aurora watched him lie under oath with the same smooth confidence he'd used to forge her signature, and felt something cold and clear replace the maternal instinct that had protected him his entire life. Emma followed, dabbing her eyes with tissue while describing how Aurora had become paranoid and isolated, how she'd pushed family away, how the nursing home placement was evidence of someone who couldn't maintain her own household. And Aurora almost admired the performance, the way her daughter had weaponized genuine concern to mask pure greed. Then Mitchell stood, and the temperature in the room changed. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence emails between Thomas Costigan and Emma Costello, dated over the past 8 weeks, discussing their mother not as a person in need of care, but as an obstacle and an asset to be managed. The first email appeared on the courtroom screen, and Aurora watched her children's faces pale. Thomas to Emma. Once we get conservatorship, we can liquidate everything and move her to state care. Should clear at least $200K after facility costs. Mitchell continued systematically destroying their case. The forged signatures on 3 financial documents, the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation from a doctor who'd never examined Aurora, the timeline showing Thomas had been using Aurora's name to secure investor funding while simultaneously claiming she was incompetent. The photographs they'd taken of Aurora and Harrison captioned not with concern, but with perfect evidence of impaired judgment. Your Honor, Mitchell said, his voice sharp as a scalpel. This isn't a conservatorship petition. It's an asset seizure disguised as filial concern, and I have proof. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her skepticism of the conservatorship now obvious, and said, Continue, Mr. Green. Margaret Lockwood took the stand next, introducing herself as a clinical psychologist with 30 years of experience in geriatric mental health, and testified that she'd conducted a comprehensive evaluation of Aurora Sullivan and found her to be exceptionally cognitively intact, emotionally resilient, and demonstrating sophisticated strategic thinking well above average for her age cohort. In fact, Margaret said, looking directly at Thomas and Emma, the scenario Mrs. Sullivan created, testing her children's motivations by temporarily concealing assets, shows a level of psychological insight and experimental design that indicates superior rather than impaired executive function. Clarice testified next about 6 months of daily interactions with Aurora, her clear communication, her independence, her rational decision-making. And when Winters tried to suggest that the nursing home placement itself proved incompetence, Clarice shut him down with Caribbean fire. Some of the wealthiest, most competent people I've ever known choose communal living for companionship and convenience. Mr. Winters, your assumption that only incompetent people live in care facilities says more about your prejudice than Mrs. Sullivan's capacity. Then Sophie took the stand, and Aurora watched Emma go rigid with betrayal. Sophie testified in a shaking voice about being coached to visit Aurora, being told her grandmother was mentally declining, being asked to report back on Aurora's behavior, and then hearing her mother laugh about manipulating the old woman. My grandmother is the smartest person I know, Sophie said, tears streaming. And I'm ashamed that I let my mom use me against her. But the turning point came when Mitchell said, "Your Honor, I'd like Mrs. Sullivan to testify on her own behalf." And Aurora took the stand and looked at the judge and spoke with the clarity of a woman who'd spent 6 months preparing for this exact moment. "Your Honor, I checked myself into Meadowbrook Nursing Home, while in perfect health and sound mind, because I wanted to answer a question that had been troubling me for years. Did my children love me, or did they love what I could provide for them? So I told them my fortune was gone, and I waited to see if they would visit. In 6 months before my cardiac episode, they visited 0 times. After my collapse, my son texted, and my daughter sent flowers. When they thought I was poor, I was worthless to them. And I submit that their behavior is the evidence this court should consider when determining competency. Not mine, but theirs." The courtroom was silent, and Aurora continued, "I'm going to tell you something my children don't know. The $40 million they think disappeared never went anywhere. It's in an irrevocable trust that I created specifically to test their motives. And Your Honor, they failed that test spectacularly, and then they attempted to use the legal system to seize control of assets they believed didn't exist, which proves this was never about my welfare, and always about their access to my money." Thomas stood up, shouting, "That's insane. You've been lying for 6 months, and you think that proves you're competent?" And Judge Hendricks slammed her gavel and said, "Mr. Costigan, sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt." Aurora looked at her son and said the words she'd been practicing. "I taught you that love was transactional because I expressed my love through provision, and that's my failure as a mother. But Thomas, you're 47 years old, and at some point, you become responsible for the man you choose to be. And you chose greed over integrity. And that's on you." Judge Hendricks reviewed the evidence for 7 minutes that felt like hours. And then she looked at Thomas and Emma with barely concealed disgust and said, "Petition for conservatorship denied. And furthermore, I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential elder fraud, forgery, and perjury. You should both retain criminal defense attorneys." The gavel fell, and Aurora felt Harrison's arms around her, and Mitchell shaking her hand, and Sophie sobbing apologies, and Judge Hendricks saying quietly as she passed, "Well played, Mrs. Sullivan, well played." Thomas and Emma left without looking at her, and Aurora realized she felt not triumph, but something quieter and sadder. Relief that the battle was over, and grief that it had to be fought at all. And if you've ever won a war but lost the relationship, tell me in the comments how you made peace with that, because Aurora's victory tastes like vindication and ashes all at once. 3 months after the courtroom victory, Aurora stood in the living room of a downtown Sacramento penthouse apartment that overlooked the river, watching Harrison make coffee in the kitchen they now shared. And she marveled at how life could pivot from loneliness to joy so quickly when you finally stopped testing love and started accepting it. They'd moved in together 6 weeks after the hearing, once Mitchell had finalized the legal aftermath, and Aurora had made peace with the complicated truth that winning the battle didn't heal the wound of knowing her children had been exactly who she'd feared they were. Thomas and Emma were facing criminal charges for elder fraud and forgery. The district attorney had built a case that would likely result in plea deals and probation rather than prison time, but their reputations were destroyed. Thomas's investors had abandoned his company, and Emma's law firm had quietly asked her to resign, and Aurora felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a tired sadness that they'd chosen this path when love had always been available if they'd wanted it. Sophie visited every Sunday, bringing homework and volleyball stories, and slowly rebuilding trust through consistency and honesty. And Aurora had established a college fund for her that was untouchable by Emma, had promised that Sophie would never be punished for her mother's choices, and watching her granddaughter flourish away from Thomas and Emma's toxic influence was the closest thing to redemption Aurora could salvage from the wreckage of her nuclear family. The $40 million had been restructured according to Aurora's new vision. $10 million to Meadowbrook Nursing Home, to build a new wing and establish a program that provided free care for elderly patients whose families had abandoned them. $5 million to a foundation supporting women entrepreneurs over 50 who were starting businesses after widowhood or divorce. $5 million divided into trust funds for Sophie and the other grandchildren with strict provisions requiring them to demonstrate financial independence before accessing the money. And the remaining $20 million split between Aurora's living expenses and a legacy trust that would continue funding elder care and women's empowerment long after she was gone. You gave away half your fortune, Harrison had said when she told him the plan, and Aurora had smiled and said, No, I invested it in the only things that actually matter: dignity for the forgotten, and opportunity for the underestimated. Which is who I was before I built that money, and who I refuse to forget now that I have it. Harrison proposed on a Tuesday in January, nothing dramatic or public, just the two of them playing chess in their living room when he moved his queen and said, I think we should get married, not because we need the legal protection or the tax benefits, but because I want to spend whatever time we have left as your husband, and not just your boyfriend. And Aurora had laughed at the callback to their fight, and said yes before he'd finished the sentence. They married in March, in a small ceremony at Meadowbrook, with Clarice as Aurora's maid of honor and Margaret and Charles as witnesses. And Sophie cried happy tears, and Mitchell brought champagne, and Judge Hendricks, who'd become an unexpected friend, officiated. And when Harrison kissed his bride, he whispered, You're the most competent decision I ever made. And Aurora felt joy that had nothing to do with money or vindication, and everything to do with being seen and chosen and loved for exactly who she was. The nursing home wing opened in April with a bronze plaque that read, The Aurora Sullivan Center for Dignified Elder Care. Because every parent deserves visitors, and no one should measure their worth by an empty chair. And Aurora attended the ribbon cutting with Harrison's hand in hers, and watched families reunite in those bright new rooms, and felt the suffocating weight of those 6 months in room 247 transform into something that had purpose and meaning. She'd learned things in that chair by the window that she couldn't have learned any other way. That love given with strings attached isn't love at all. That you teach people how to value you by how you value yourself. That testing people might give you answers, but it can't give you peace. That the courage to accept real love is harder than the courage to endure false love. And that at 81 years old, it wasn't too late to start over and choose differently and build a life based on connection rather than transaction. Thomas and Emma never apologized, never reached out, never acknowledged their fraud or their cruelty. And Aurora made peace with that by recognizing that their inability to love her properly was their loss, not her failure. That she could grieve the children she'd wanted while accepting the adults they'd actually become. And that forgiveness didn't require relationship. She could release the anger without opening the door. 1 year after the hearing, Aurora and Harrison hosted Sunday dinners in their apartment for what they called their chosen family. Sophie, Clarice, Margaret, and Charles. Mitchell, a rotating cast of friends from Meadowbrook, who'd become dear during those dark months. And sometimes Judge Hendricks when her schedule allowed. And Aurora would look around the table at people who'd shown up, not because they wanted something, but because they cared. And she'd feel wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with the bank account, and everything to do with the richness of being genuinely known. She was 82 now. Her heart was monitored but stable. Her mind was sharp as ever. And she made peace with the fact that her legacy wouldn't be the children who bore her name, but the lives she'd touched, and the systems she'd changed, and the love she'd finally learned to accept from a silver-haired former judge who beat her at chess more often than not, and made her laugh every single day. On the anniversary of the day she checked into Meadowbrook, Aurora and Harrison visited room 247. now occupied by a woman named Dorothy, whose children visited twice a week thanks to the family counseling program Aurora's donation had funded. And Aurora sat in that visitor chair that had been empty for so long and felt the circle complete. She'd sat in the loneliness so that others wouldn't have to, had endured the test so she could build the solution, had survived the darkest hour to create dawn for people who'd been living in the same darkness. Do you regret it? Harrison asked as they drove home. The 6 months, the test, all of it. And Aurora thought about the question seriously before answering. I regret that it was necessary. I regret what the answer revealed. But I don't regret knowing the truth, because the truth set me free to build this life with you. And Harrison, this life is worth every empty day that came before it. That night, they sat on their balcony watching the city lights reflect on the river. And Aurora thought about the woman she'd been sitting in that vinyl chair, waiting for headlights that never came. And she sent that woman a message across time. You will survive this. You will find love again. You will matter to people who see you as more than what you can provide. And the fortune you built will ultimately buy you something you never expected. The freedom to discover who you are when you're not performing the role of mother or provider or foundation. Just Aurora, just yourself, just enough. If this story has touched you, if you've ever had to choose between toxic family and chosen family, if you've ever discovered that your worth isn't determined by who fails to see it, leave me a comment telling me what spoke to you. Because these stories matter, and your stories matter, and we're all out here trying to figure out how to love and be loved without losing ourselves in the process. And before you go, make sure you're subscribed, because next week we have another story that's going to absolutely wreck you in the best way. Aurora Sullivan didn't get the ending she'd imagined when she was a young mother building an empire for ungrateful children. But she got something better. She got the ending she deserved, surrounded by love that was freely given, building a legacy that would outlive her fortune, and finally, beautifully, completely at peace.